Fox on top of terror and the tour. U.S. cities on alert this hour in the wake of the U.K. bombing as investigators uncover brand new information. We've got it for you. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump calling on world leaders to help wipe terror off the map. He is about to put the final stamp on a week-long overseas tour. Welcome, everybody. I'm David Asman in for Neil Cavuto today, and we are kicking off a very busy Cost of Freedom. The president's set to deliver his closing speech in the next hour. John Roberts is live in Italy, where it's all going to happen. But first to Rick Leventhal in Manchester, where brand new developments are unfolding. Rick.
And David, Britain's prime minister has reduced the terrorism threat level from critical to severe, which is where it was before Monday's attack. That could be seen as a sign of progress here, but the prime minister is warning everyone to remain vigilant and stay on alert because they're saying that the threat of another attack remains very real here. There is a three-day bank holiday weekend that's now already begun, so a lot of people out on the street and a lot of events, but they're worried that people might be letting their guard down, and they're asking them not to do that. There was another raid this morning in connection with the Manchester Arena bombing. It's at least the 13th raid that's been carried out so far. This one also using a controlled explosion to gain access to a building where they arrested 2 more suspects. That means a total of 11 people are now in custody here with possible ties to terror and possible ties to a network that may have been supporting the suspected suicide bomber Salman Abedi, who authorities believe may have assembled his backpack bomb in a rented apartment about 2 miles from Manchester Arena just days before the bombing. Abedi may have gotten his training in Syria or Libya, where his father and brother are being held for questioning, but authorities are also concerned that he might have built more than one device, and that's why we're seeing armed police patrolling trains for the first time across the UK and extra security as part of the so-called Ring of Steel, protecting some 1,300 events that will be held across Great Britain this weekend. Meanwhile, this memorial in St. Anne's Square, a tribute to the 22 people killed in Monday's attack, the youngest of them just 8 years old. 116 people received treatment for injuries suffered that night. 63 of them are still in hospitals, and David, 20 of those 63 are in critical care this morning.
Rick, I'm just curious, even though they have ticked down the alert level of 1 notch, they must still be worried about other networks. Is there any sign that there is a terror network other than the one that they have focused on that led to these 11 arrests?
Well, listen, MI5 has been incredibly busy over these past few months investigating any number of people. In fact, we're told that there were some 3,000 people under suspicion as part of 500 separate investigations. So the agency is overwhelmed. This was just one of many that they were investigating. Salman Abedi was on their radar as one of many people that they were looking at. So now they're tightening the cordon around the city of Manchester and the surrounding suburbs. They have obviously taken a lot of people into custody who may have connections to Abedi. But again, they're worried that he may have assembled more than one device, and there are other people they were already looking at. So they are definitely deeply concerned as we head into this weekend.
And finally, Rick, even though the alert status has come down a little bit, it doesn't sound like there are any fewer police and armed forces on the streets.
Just the opposite, more. We're seeing far more, and people who live here are seeing far more than they're used to seeing for the very reasons we've discussed.
Rick Leventhal in Manchester. Rick, thank you very much. Well, U.S. cities are on very high alert this busy travel holiday weekend after another known wolf commits a terror attack. So the question is whether what happened over there will bleed into what's happening here. We have some guests with us, national security expert Rebecca Heinrichs and Zuhdi Jasser from the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Rebecca, first you, U.S. authorities must be working very closely with UK authorities, sharing information. We know that there was this concern on the part of the UK authorities that perhaps somebody was leaking stuff that they shouldn't have about their investigation. But any signs so far that what happened over there could happen here or might happen here?
Of course, there's always a risk that what happened there might happen here. Thankfully, we don't have the same degree of the problems that Europe has. Europe has sort of become a cautionary tale for the United States. The open borders, the flood of migrants coming from war-torn nations, the lack of assimilation in Islamic communities where many individuals are become budding jihadists by listening to their religious leaders and their parents, and they don't see themselves first and foremost as British citizens. They see themselves first and foremost as members of, this great Islamic community, the Ummah, where they take jihadism very, very extremely seriously. But we don't have that same problem here, but we do have some degree of that problem here. So we need to be on high alert. I thought the president's urging to drive out terrorists in our communities was very important that he gave in Riyadh.
Very strong. However, Zuhdi, we still have the courts questioning his travel restrictions that he wants to put in, and we should emphasize that the UK killer had just been to Libya. He'd been there a couple of times, but he'd just come back from Libya. Libya is one of those failed states. If you Google Libya, you'll find out exactly how failed it is. There's no semblance of a solid, centralized government there. That's the reason the president wanted to keep people like the killer that we see there from coming here.
Well, David, it's really not rocket science, and yet while Muslims may be more assimilated in America, I think we're falling down the same slope, but just not as steeply as Europe. And that slope is the lack of willingness, the lack of courage to address the nonviolent precursors. Because right now, all we're focused on is that last moment when they're going to strap the vest on, when they're expressing some element of wanting to kill somebody, be violent. But there are so many obvious signs, precursors before that, that we could be focusing on those 3,500 that are known wolves, as you mentioned, and the few hundred in America that have gone to Syria or Libya and come back. What should we be focusing on? The list is so easy. Are they worried about whining about Islamophobia? Check. Are they anti-Semitic? Check. Are they worried and prefer the Sharia state versus Western democracy? Do they favor or blame, Western democracies for the death of Muslims? It looks like this guy's family and his close community, his mosque, as much as the mosque condemned ISIS, they had anti-Semitic screeds, homophobic screeds. So all of these things are so obvious, and yet we're ignoring them because our politically correct sort of fratricide is ignoring the ideologies.
And Rebecca, to Zuhdi's point, we don't want to be reactive as what happened in Great Britain. We want to be proactive. We want to stop the terror from happening before it happens. And one of the ways to do that, according to the president anyway, even though the courts deny that his intentions are sincere, is by preventing people from these failed states from coming and visiting us. It's clear that anybody, you don't go to Libya, a failed state which is in many parts run by terrorists, for a vacation. You just don't.
That's exactly right. And Dr. Jasser is exactly right. So that's one, of course, that's just one method that we can use to try to prevent some of this from happening. But you've got to get to the root of the ideology that Dr. Jasser is talking about here, too. And so, and again, the law enforcement tools that we have are not the problem. It comes from the political class. Does the political class understand the nature of the threat? If it understands that human beings are not just motivated by, the material, by poverty, if they have an education or not, they're motivated by this higher calling, finding meaning in life. And a lot of these young budding jihadists are finding that in their religious leaders and texts and their parents. And so we have to be in tune to that.
Well, and clearly we saw way back in 9/11, Zuhdi, that a lot of the terrorists came from upper middle class backgrounds. It's not poverty that drives them. It's ideology. And it's also the idea that the terrorists are winning. They spin this notion that every terror attack means a win for the Islamic State. That's why the president uses now new rhetoric that we certainly didn't hear from the Obama administration. Some people say it's simplistic. Other people say it's right on. Let me just play some of the president's tape on that and get your reaction.
I won't call them monsters because they would like that term. They would think that's a great name. I will call them from now on losers, because that's what they are.
Losers. It sounds so simplistic, but does he hit a point?
Oh, absolutely. These radicals divide the world into the land of Islam and the land of war. So they're in a war. We need to be at war and take the war to them. Muslims, especially in the West, we live in a laboratory where we can fight these ideas, these theopolitical ideas, where sadly there's some studies that show that more British Muslims are signing up with ISIS to go to Syria and Libya than with their own military. That's the battle for the soul of Islam, which is, do you feel more loyalty to Western secular states, or do you feel more loyalty to the jihad? And as much as it was great to see President Trump take it to the belly of the beast in Saudi Arabia, you know, starting a counterterrorism center in Riyadh is sort of like starting a counter-cocaine center in Colombia. We need to do this in the West. We need to have huge centers built by Muslims, led by Muslims, to fight this ideology within our mosques about loyalty and allegiance to Western democracy.
Zuhdi, I think you're absolutely right, but at the same time, I thought that those were pretty profound words when he was speaking truth to power in Saudi Arabia. I know they felt very uncomfortable when he was saying that, but he had the guts to say it. Thank you very much, Zuhdi and Rebecca. We appreciate you coming in. Have a good weekend. Well, intelligence leaks now becoming a matter of life and death. The Trump administration vowing to find and prosecute those leaking sensitive details to the press. Are they any closer to finding the culprits?
If we have intelligence officials doing this for political purposes to attack the presidency, that is equally as disturbing and unlawful.
And live to Italy now, where President Donald Trump will be speaking in just about an hour. Of course, we're going to cover that live. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts has been all over the world in this trip. And I must imagine, John, that the White House is pretty pleased with how they've done, right?
David, I think it's safe to say that they're very happy with how things have come off, particularly in Saudi Arabia and Israel. Gary Cohn and H.R. McMaster a short time ago holding a press conference in which they said that the president had, through these visits and with European leaders as well, really deepened the relationships that he has developed with these leaders, and hoping that that will pay off in the long run for the United States in terms of new economic deals, new military deals, new spirit of cooperation. The G7 just wrapping up now. You mentioned that the president will be making remarks behind, on the other side of Mount Etna there at the Sigonella Naval Air Station. He'll give an address to sailors and naval aviators there, in which he'll talk not just about military issues, but also talk about his trip. It'll be kind of a wrap-up for the president. And the president making news just a short time ago, tweeting about the Paris Climate Accord, saying this, quote, "I will make my final decision on the Paris Accord next week." The president has been mulling over whether or not to pull the United States out of the climate agreement, according to Gary Cohn, his chief economic advisor. He's been having a lot of conversations with European leaders and clearly also with Shinzo Abe of Japan, getting their take on the Paris Climate Accord, why they think the United States should stay in it. And according to Cohn, the president's thinking on all of this has evolved over the last few days. Listen to what Cohn told us.
I think his views are evolving, and he came here to learn, and he came here to get smarter. He came here to hear people's world leaders' views, some of which have been involved with the Paris Agreement for many, many years.
Now, as the president wings his way back to the United States later on today, he will be flying headlong into a new controversy swirling around Russia after the Washington Post reported that Russia's ambassador to the United States, Sergei Kislyak, was picked up on an intelligence intercept back in December, saying that he had had conversations with Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, about creating a secure line of communication between the Trump transition and Russia. I've been talking with sources close to Jared Kushner who say, well, if there was such a conversation, it was likely to establish a secure line of communication for Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, who was also in that meeting, so that he would be able to talk back channel with Russian generals and get up to speed on Syria before the Trump administration took over. Reuters also has a story in which it says that Jared Kushner had 3 previously undisclosed conversations with Sergei Kislyak. 2 of those were phone calls, one in April and one in November. I got a statement from Jamie Gorelick, who is Jared Kushner's personal attorney, telling Fox News, quote, "Mr. Kushner participated in thousands of calls in this time period. He has no recollection of the calls described. We have asked Reuters, the source of it, for the dates of such alleged calls so that we may look at it and respond, but we have not received such information." Back on the Russia and the secure back channel communications, it's also possible, David, that some of that, at least the way it was characterized, was disinformation on the part of Sergei Kislyak, according to intelligence officials. that he knew he was on a line that was being monitored and was maybe just trying to muddy the waters a little bit. We hope to get some more detail on this in the days ahead, David, but for now, that's what we have from the White House.
Extraordinary stuff. John Roberts, thank you very much.
I think if intelligence is leaked, that needs to be investigated and prosecuted. If we have intelligence officials doing this for political purposes to attack the presidency, that is equally as disturbing and unlawful.
It is wrong, it is arrogant, it is disrespectful to the people of Greater Manchester, but mainly to the families who've lost loved ones and to those injured. And that's why I'm saying today, from the top of the American government, they should condemn it and they should tell it to stop right away.
So there are leaks over there, there are leaks over here, there are leaks everywhere. How do we find the leakers? How do we get to the bottom of this? For analysis now, we have Fred Fleitz. He's a former CIA analyst, and Lisa Giovinazzo, who's an attorney, to talk about the legal ramifications of all this. But Fred, first to you, who would have access to, we learned this week that the NSA was not as tight with their information, their intel, as we had thought. That, in fact, the FBI director gave us assurances that this NSA intel was not getting out. Well, we found out it was. So it seems that a lot of people had access to secure information.
I think that's right. We're seeing an unprecedented number of leaks. In mid-2004, the Wall Street Journal ran an editorial called the CIA Insurgency because all the leaks to stop President Bush from being reelected. But this is leaks at a much greater level. And I think to address them, there has to be a significant house cleaning in federal agencies, and the president has to name throughout the government confirmable and non-confirmable positions to get these sensitive positions out of the hands of people put in place by the Obama administration. I think that would go a long way to addressing this problem.
And Lisa, there has to be a price to pay. I mean, this is illegal stuff, leaking classified information. I'm smiling, but it's no joke. And some people feel so passionately about getting this stuff out that they are risking severe jail time, either that or they're not afraid.
It's exactly right. You can face up to 10 to 20 years. This is all covered, by the way. Obviously, classified information cannot be leaked. But for certain individuals, any information, if you're an officer, a government employee, a contractor, all of that could be subject to prosecution to leak information.
The Wall Street Journal information about the Kushner leak, if it's true, it may just be misinformation passed on by the Russians, but they cite just one source. The Washington Post cites several sources for the same story. If there are several sources, I'm just wondering if a conspiracy charge might be in the mix as well, maybe some kind of RICO conspiracy.
Well, there could be. Now you're talking about whether or not reporters are involved in sourcing the information. Now remember, media in general hasn't been prosecuted on a very vast basis for receiving and publishing information.
Well, nor do I think they should be, but on the other hand, the people leaking definitely should be,
Well,
right?
The people leaking should be, and they are subject to stiff penalty and jail time. But if we do find that the media becomes part and parcel, they're aware of the leak, like when Trump's IRS records were leaked to the New York Times.
Right.
He put out a tweet saying, please publish this information. Was that then garnered? Did somebody in the IRS and somebody in the media participate in getting that information public?
Fred,
so that's
very quickly, we're running out of time, but do you think that this comes from somebody in the Trump administration, somebody in the Trump team, or do you think it comes from a careerist that has an axe to grind against Trump?
I think it's careerist. I also note that many of these leaks are attributed to current and former officials. And I think that's because the Obama administration began these leaks, and I think Obama holdovers are collaborating with former Obama officials, and they are going together to the news media to undermine this president.
Fred Fleitz, Lisa Giovinazzo, thank you very much both for coming in. Appreciate it. Well, tax cuts, is it just a bunch of happy talk? Why controversial comments from former Speaker John Boehner have Steve Forbes anything but happy? He's here. And after a whirlwind tour with terror in the backdrop, President Trump is coming home.
This budget steals hundreds of billions of dollars from critical job-creating investments in infrastructure, education, and clean energy.
Would decimate health care options for rural Americans, children, seniors.
Harder for working families to get the health care they desperately need. Harder for families to put food on the table.
So the sky is falling. Children are going to be dying because of this Trump budget. You might think that they're draconian cuts, but in fact, it doesn't look that way when you actually read the thing. And we've got it right here. Steve Forbes has been along with me to look at this budget. And Steve, I go through the Trump budget, and I look at, just take two line items from this Trump budget, Medicaid and Medicare. Medicaid, it's now at $368 billion. In 10 years, the Trump budget has it up to $518 billion. That's not a cut. That's a huge increase. Medicare, so that's the young. The old, it's now $588 billion in Medicare spending. In 10 years, it's going to be over $1 trillion. That's almost double. So how do they get these figures that everything is being cut to the bone?
Well, on Medicaid, too, they leave out what the states are going to be spending. That's going to go up another $50+ billion in the next 10 years at least. So what we have here is typical Washington gobbledygook to confuse us. They have the assumption that the budget must grow a certain percent each year. So if it's supposed to go up 4% but only goes up 2%, that counts as a cut. Only in Washington would an increase count as a cut. So what they're proposing here is really kind of reforms that we had 20 years ago on welfare, where they try to turn welfare into workfare. So on food stamps, you work if you can instead of just getting it as a handout. Try to get people back on their feet again. And that's what Mulvaney and Trump wants to do.
Mick Mulvaney, who's the head of the OMB, they're the guys who put this budget together. He said it's much more compassionate to want to get people off of welfare than to keep them on. That's his point. I think he makes a good one.
And that's how you get a real strong safety net, is with a strong economy and helping people rather than hurting people.
And when you look, you know, I grew up in Washington, and it is it's not a real place. I mean, during the height of the recession in 2008, 2009, Washington, all the restaurants were full. You couldn't get a room in a hotel in Washington. You would think that the economy would be booming. Outside of Washington, it was very different. And in the years of the Obama administration, from 2009 up until last year, median household income was flat. While the government keeps getting these raises, the individual American doesn't. Government gets money, individual Americans don't.
Yes, Washington lives off at the expense of the American people. And what happened in the Obama administration is they try to increase dependency instead of reducing it. So food stamps went from 14 million people in December of 2007 to 44 million today. And that wasn't just the recession. That was encouraging dependency, because they see that as political power. And that's what they're mad about at the Trump budget. It's going back to what the Clinton budget did in the mid-1990s, dare I say it, to help people get back on their feet, help get this economy growing. And that's how you get a strong safety net, is when you have a strong economy and people can have higher incomes.
And say what you will about Bill Clinton, but he knew how to make deals. And he made deals with a Republican Congress. Newt Gingrich was in charge of the Congress back then. They made deals not only to get spending down, but also to really reform welfare, to require able-bodied people to work for the money that they were getting rather than just sit at home and take it in.
And these anti-poverty programs, and since then, have mushroomed. We have 90 different anti-poverty programs, 22 housing assistance programs, 17 food assistance programs. And are they really helping that much? No. You take Medicaid, for example. Combined state and federal spending, it's now $7,000 per person. I guarantee if you gave that $7,000 to each person in that household, say a family of four, $28,000, they could, in a medical savings account, shop for good insurance and have money left over.
Meanwhile, as you say, growth is the answer to the problem, and tax cuts really stimulate growth. We've seen it happen all the time, whether it's a Democrat like Clinton or JFK or, of course, Ronald Reagan. But John Boehner says it's just happy talk, all of this talk about lowering taxes, to which you say what?
That's what happens when you stay in Washington too long. I'm glad he's finally out of it, but the vapor's still, and I'm afraid to affect a poor guy. But Reagan showed, and other good presidents have shown, that if you push for something, push for a major reform, you will get it and change the landscape. I'm old enough to remember how the 1970s, terrible decade, Americans was in a permanent decline. Can't get the economy moving. It's going to be a very slow recovery. Reagan comes in, stops the inflation, cuts taxes. America has a 20-year boom. We can do it again, but you got to push it, or else Washington won't do it.
You know, I mentioned Boehner, but of course Democrats also saying the same thing. They're saying there's a lot of creative accounting going on. Senator Ron Wyden said that, other Democrats. But meanwhile, these are the guys who claimed that Obamacare was going to make premiums come down. And they claimed that they wasn't going to add a dime to the deficit. We saw the deficit double to $20 trillion.
Yes, and families are going to save $2,500. I hope no family spent that money in anticipation of what Obama was going to give them. And you saw the same thing. Keep your doctor, keep your insurance, typical Washington promise. One thing to keep in mind, I hate to use numbers on Saturday morning, but Trump's budget goes from a little over $4 trillion to $5.7 trillion.
Right.
$1.67 trillion increase in 10 years. That's a cut. What world are they living in?
Inside the Beltway. It's not real world inside the Beltway. Steve Forbes, great to see you, Steve.
Good to see you, David. Thank you.
And coming up, forget Russia spying on us. Has the Obama administration been doing it illegally for years? Former CIA Director Jim Woolsey on the new revelations that are unfolding. And did you catch these world leaders snickering the other day when Trump was talking? Why someone here says it will be President Trump who actually gets the last laugh. It is true that the alert status over in Britain has come down a bit, but hundreds of people were just evacuated from London's Old Vic Theatre. Police are on the scene. Both the audience and the cast have been told to leave. Police were seen cordoning off the area. No other details at the moment. Again, Britain is on heightened alert after the Manchester bombing has come down a tick, but the nerves are still raw. Meanwhile, there's this.
If all NATO members had spent just 2% of their GDP on defense last year, we would have had another $119 billion for our collective defense and for the financing of additional NATO reserves.
Kind of smirking and snickering. Did you get that? As President Trump scolded the Europeans for not paying their fair share, what they said they were going to do. But maybe President Trump is getting the last laugh because he just tweeted the following, quote, many NATO countries have agreed to step up payments considerably, as they should. Money is beginning to pour in. NATO will be much stronger. Now, Gardner joins us, as well as Christy Setzer and Lee Carter. And Lee, let me start with you. I don't think there has ever been a better example of European snobbiness from our perspective and sort of ungratefulness for everything that we have done. Let's face it, NATO, I know they came to our aid after 9/11, and I'm grateful to them for that, but really, we are there more for them than they are for us.
I mean, there's no question. But, I mean, first of all, what were they laughing at? We don't even necessarily know. Was there something in their earpieces? Did somebody make a joke? So we don't necessarily know what they were laughing at. If they were laughing at the president or eye-rolling at the president because he was calling them out, it's completely inappropriate. It's disrespectful. It's totally a snub saying that, you know, we're not respecting the United States because Donald Trump is, in fact, the president of the United States. And we have, as you say, done so much for NATO, and they've already agreed to be paying for their fair share. So I think this is an absolute, if this is, in fact, that they were laughing at him, I think it's absolute disgrace.
Well, and Niall, then there was the setting. The setting in which this took place is the new NATO building. It's hard to get an exact cost of the thing, but it probably cost around $1.5 billion to create a bureaucracy, essentially. I don't know how much effort is going to go into defending the future of Europe or the free world by what they've constructed there in Brussels.
Well, there's certainly no shortage of bureaucracy in Brussels, that's for sure. I have to agree that the smirking from some European leaders, especially the French president, the Belgian prime minister, the leader of Luxembourg as well, was absolutely appalling. And I think Emmanuel Macron, the new French president, is behaving like a little schoolboy at the moment, frankly, extremely rude. While the French economy is sinking like the Titanic. And I think that there was a lot of disrespect on display there. It's important for European leaders to remember that their freedom and security has depended upon the U.S. security umbrella for over 70 years. And they do owe an immense debt of gratitude, of course, to the United States for their own security. It's time for all European countries to step up to the plate, invest more in their own defenses, and ensure that the NATO alliance is strengthened for the next 70 years.
Christy, I know you're a Democrat and you're not a big fan of Donald Trump, but on the other hand, when you see a U.S. president go to Europe and be snubbed by European leaders, doesn't it rile even you?
Yeah, it's embarrassing, but you have to put it in context as to why this was happening. Look, these very same leaders had a great deal of respect for Barack Obama. If they don't have respect, it is specifically for Donald Trump, and you need to look at why that is. He went over there like the ugly American. There was video of him literally pushing and shoving the president of Montenegro out of the way, of putting the new president of France, Macron, into this weird, bizarre, I'm a tough guy, death grip handshake. And then also lecturing them on something that, frankly, he doesn't really know very much about. You read that tweet about money pouring in.
Hold on a second,
That's
Christy.
not how NATO works.
He hasn't gotten much wrong. It's true that most of the European countries that he put his finger on as saying you're not paying their fair share are not. They're supposed to pay, as parts of NATO, 2% of their budget on defenses. And I'll throw this to Lee, but frankly, I think when most Americans see the Europeans snickering at Donald Trump saying something that's true, he does get the last laugh, don't you
David,
think?
can I just say one more quick thing? Look, it's a defensible argument. It is a defensible, argument to make. However, there is also something called diplomacy. When you're going to talk to these people who, as we've said, are our greatest allies, who have been with us after 9/11.
Hold on, okay,
maybe,
you got your saying, Christy, but Lee, I just have to say that when most Americans, hold on a second, Lee, most Americans, I think, would much rather see a president of the United States standing up for Americans overseas than getting patted on the back by his European friends overseas, don't you think?
You're absolutely right. I mean, the reason that Donald Trump is president today was a lot because of his messaging, which was make America great again and put America first. And so I think that when he goes over there and speaks up for America, it's something that resonates. And I think that talk about diplomacy. You want to talk about diplomacy?
Yeah.
How about these leaders laughing at the president of the United States who has supported them over tough times? That's not diplomacy.
And Niall, I'll give you the last word. President Obama, when he went over there, it's true. They all loved him. They gave him a Nobel Peace Prize before he even did anything, for God's sakes. So they loved the guy. But at the same time, what did that get him? What did that get him in terms of deals? What did that get him in terms of support? It didn't get them to pay up what they owed as their parts of NATO.
Yes, that's right. And global leadership is not about being loved or being popular. It's about projecting, I think, aggressively U.S. interests on the world stage. And I don't think that Barack Obama did that. In fact, I think many European leaders, while superficially saying they liked Obama, viewed him as very, very weak, actually. And I do think that the United States under President Obama did not project the kind of U.S. leadership that we needed to see. And I think we did see a very strong projection of U.S. leadership throughout the past 7 days on the international stage. And certainly, I think, the end of the era of leading from behind, which President Obama advanced.
Okay. Thank you very much, Niall, Lee, and Christy. Appreciate it. What you are seeing on the left side of the screen is the air base from which the president is going to leave his trip to come back home. Sigonella Air Base in Italy. It's a naval, a naval air station. As you can see, a lot of people are holding cameras up, pointing in the right direction. I think that's to where the president's plane has come in and where he may depart from as well. So there clearly is action taking place. The president is going to be speaking to the crowd there. Again, it's Memorial Day weekend, folks. It's a perfect time to speak to our troops overseas. That's exactly what the president is going to do before he boards Air Force One and comes back home. And an explosive new report suggesting that the Obama administration is not only spying on Americans, but then sharing that information. So where is it going, and how do we stop it from traveling any further? Former CIA Chief Jim Woolsey is here in a moment.